is the longest synoptic gospel. Its true distinction, however, lies in its unique architectural structure. Unlike Matthew or Mark, the author of Luke explicitly defines his methodology right at the start. He is compiling a meticulously researched account, tracing all things carefully from the beginning to provide his reader with historical certainty. This reveals the text's central structural anomaly. Luke was engineered as the first half of a continuous two-volume historical treatise. The Gospel locks directly into a second text, the Book of Acts. While Matthew constructs his account around Jewish prophecy to convince a Jewish audience, Luke directs his writing outward. He addresses his work to a Gentile figure named Theophilus, pointing to a much broader, non-Jewish readership. This creates a distinct shift in tone. If Mark is action-oriented and Matthew is highly devotional, Luke's approach is strictly analytical, an academic organizing raw data into a chronological narrative. The mind behind this organization belonged to a Greek-educated physician. He holds a unique position in the biblical canon as the only Gentile contributor to the New Testament. The spatial and temporal coordinates of this text place its completion in Rome during the early 60s AD. This two-volume paradigm is the mechanism designed to deliver that promised certainty from his prologue. A single book could detail the origins of the faith. A two-volume set provided the historical weight needed to prove the movement's lasting validity. The Gospel establishes the historical bedrock, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. Volume 2, Acts, builds the geographical expansion of the early church directly on that foundation. To fully grasp his message of a universal Son of Man, we first have to reconstruct the dossier of the historian himself. We have to map out his identity, his methodology, and the high-stakes Roman environment where he finalized his work. The internal data points straight to a highly educated outsider. The Greek vocabulary used throughout the Gospel is sophisticated, utilizing classical literary forms that are absent in the other accounts. We can cross-reference this linguistic profile with Paul's letter to the Colossians, where he explicitly identifies Luke, the beloved physician. In that same letter, Paul lists his Jewish companions, those of the circumcision, and places Luke in a separate, distinct category, proving his Gentile status. We also find sudden shifts in the Book of Acts, where the narrator switches from they to we. These subtle pronoun changes place the author directly alongside the Apostle Paul during his travels. This companionship was likely a physical necessity. Paul extensively documented his own severe physical ailments, including what he called a thorn in the flesh in his second letter to the Corinthians. Between shipwrecks, beatings, and brutal prison stays across the Mediterranean, a personal physician was essential to keeping Paul alive on his grueling missionary circuits. Ancient medicine relied on crude physical instruments, like these Roman-era medical tools. A practitioner required strict observation and precision, traits that directly translate into Luke's clinical descriptions of illnesses and healings in the text. That same diagnostic eye was applied to his research. When he interviewed eyewitnesses, he gathered data with the structured skepticism and rigor of a medical professional diagnosing a patient. The result is a fascinating historical paradox. This detailed history of the Jewish Messiah was compiled by a Greek doctor. His outsider status, combined with his professional training and observation, made him the ideal candidate to translate a localized Jewish narrative into a universally accessible account for the broader Gentile world. To accurately date the completion of this two-volume work, we look at the abrupt ending of its second half, the Book of Acts. Acts concludes with Paul under house arrest in Rome, waiting to state his case before Caesar around 62 AD. Historical tradition places his captivity here, at the Mamertinum prison. Because the narrative omits the Neronian persecutions of 64 AD and never records Paul's eventual execution, the research and drafting of the Gospel was finalized during this specific window of Roman confinement. This brings us back to the prologue. The name Theophilus is preceded by an honorific title, Most Excellent, pointing to a high-ranking Roman official or an aristocratic patron. Luke promises him asphalia, a Greek legal and historical term meaning unshakable certainty. A Roman official examining a rapidly spreading movement needed to know if it was a political threat to the empire. To provide that legal certainty, Luke curated existing written records and conducted systematic interviews with primary eyewitnesses, compiling the data while Paul was detained. Drafting a favorable history of a man executed for treason by a Roman governor while sitting in the capital of the Roman Empire carried immense geopolitical risk. This environment heavily influenced the text. Throughout the Gospel, Roman centurions and officials are consistently portrayed as objective, sympathetic, or openly declaring Jesus' innocence. He took the fragmented oral traditions and theological claims of the early disciples and structured them into an orderly, verifiable sequence of events that a Roman mind could respect. Luke Acts operates as a defense brief. It is a historical dossier compiled under the shadow of the emperor, engineered to prove to the Roman world that Christianity was not a volatile insurgency, but an established, peaceful, and universal truth. The structural engineering of this dossier serves a specific theological target, presenting Jesus as the universal Son of Man. The entire text pivots on a thesis statement found in Luke 19:10. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Because Luke approaches the material as a Gentile, he actively shifts the narrative center of gravity away from exclusive Jewish messianic fulfillment and toward a broad, inclusive humanity. This diagram shows the Gospel's geographic architecture divided into 3 distinct blocks: the ministry in Galilee, the long journey to Jerusalem, and the final Passion Week. All 3 narrative sections funnel directly into that core mission of seeking the lost. To anchor this universal mission, Luke emphasizes the physical, flesh and blood reality of Jesus, dedicating significant space to the biological details of his birth, childhood, and physical maturation. He also meticulously defines who the lost actually are. In Luke's account, the focus zeroes in on society's margins: women, the poor, despised tax collectors, and fellow Gentiles. Within this middle journey section, he includes parables found nowhere else, like the Good Samaritan, which intentionally elevates an ethnic outsider over the established religious power structures of the day. Even the genealogy is recalibrated. Rather than stopping at Abraham, the father of the Jewish nation, Luke traces the bloodline back to Adam, the father of the human race. The Son of Man title becomes the vital connective tissue. It links the authority of a divine savior directly to the vulnerability of a suffering human. By engineering his narrative around this specific motif, Luke takes a regional story from the province of Judea and scales it into a global invitation for all of humanity. But that invitation is why the Gospel of Luke requires the book of Acts to reach its theological closure. The universal mission established in Volume 1 only achieves its intended resolution through the explosive, cross-cultural expansion of the early church in Volume 2. The narrative hands off the physical, flesh and blood ministry of Jesus to the ongoing, decentralized power of the Spirit working through his followers. This executes the precise historical intent Luke laid out early in his Gospel, to build an irrefutable record proving that all flesh shall see the salvation of God. The 2-volume work begins in the village of Bethlehem, and it systematically pulls back until it encompasses the entire Mediterranean basin, ending in the geopolitical center of Rome. It required an outsider, a Greek physician accustomed to looking at the human body as a whole, to recognize the global potential of a movement that others viewed merely as a localized sect. Ultimately, Luke Acts remains a unified historical theological project. The demand for certainty that drove his research provided the primary framework that modern scholars rely on to critically analyze the first-century origins of the faith. His greatest achievement was cementing the structural link between the historical reality of Jesus and the subsequent reality of the Church. Luke constructed a meticulously researched historical reality. He built a bridge from the roads of Galilee to the center of the Roman Empire, documenting salvation as a universal fact that reaches beyond the borders of Judea.